Before we start building a workshop on creating our own promise library, let's talk a little bit more about promises in general. And we've had some experience working with the Bluebird library, so some of this stuff we've seen already. But let's take a look at how things are done without promises, and then we'll get an idea of what the big advantages are. So here in the Mongoose library, we could end up using Mongoose. In this case, we would have there's an assumption here that we're going to be doing a request and response. Maybe this is sitting inside of Express, and we want to make sure that we get our results before we end up sending anything out to the response. So in this case, we're doing a query through the page collection that's in a Mongo database, and we're passing in a callback function, and the callback function is going to get called when one of two things happens. Either we end up having an error, or in fact, we're able to find the page that we are looking for, in which case we end up dealing with it, and either we send a status of 500 as a server error, or we end up just sending out the page. If we compare this to this async implementation, and we compare it to a promise, we see that the big difference is that this Mongoose method actually returns a promise, and we can end up calling then on it, because that's what promises allow us to do. They give us an object that we could call then, and in this case, what we're able to do is we're able to separate out the two different types of responses, so that we don't have to start querying what our arguments are in the case of this last one and figuring out whether we have an error or we have a page. Here we could say, hey, look, here's a function that we're going to use if in fact we were successful, and here's a failure function. So right off the bat, we see that we have a possible success handler, which is one function, and we have a failure handler, which is another function. So again, the reason why this works is that what we have here is we've gone from something which is an asynchronous callback to a promise. And so internally, what's going to happen is that the first function will end up getting called if we're successful, and the second function will end up getting called if there's a failure. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that you could actually create this promise, and you could end up calling it later on. So this query ends up giving us a promise, and we can actually put it in a variable. We can pass it somewhere else. We can end up moving it around, and we've got this portability where we could return this from another function and have that other function end up calling it. So again, it just becomes you could think of this as an object, the promise as an object, which is thenable, that we can end up sending around. On the same token, here's an example where we could actually export the promise from a module. And one of the things that you've seen before is how we've actually used a promise to determine whether or not we had a connection to a database, and we did sort of a lazy loading of that promise. So if the promise had been created, we return it. If it hadn't been created, we end up creating it. So this opens up all kinds of possibilities, right? So here we have an example, and this is actually, instead of using the Q library, and we'll talk about the different implementations of the promise libraries, but instead of using the Bluebird library, here we're using the Q library. So what we're doing here is that initially we're creating an array, and this array is going to be holding on to 7 promises. The all method of the library is keeping track of which promises have been completed, and in fact, the only time that then ends up getting called is when all the promises have been resolved, in which case we'll have the whatever ends up getting returned from the Dave find one collection, we'll have all this information, and we can have the ability to render out a weekly calendar. So here you're seeing an example, right? We've mentioned this many times before. When you think about all, think about your promises being run in parallel, right? There's no dependency on different promises. Again, you have no way really of knowing, since this is asynchronous, when these are going to end up completing. So this now opens up another opportunity, which is the idea of chaining. So that if there was a dependency, in some case we could get a promise for a user, we could end up getting a promise for messages, which would give us messages. We could get a promise for comments. And what we could actually do here is that if there's any error in the chain at any point, we could end up catching this error. So that leads us into the definition of what a promise is, right? So a promise represents the eventual result of an asynchronous operation. And I mean, you don't really need a promise if what you're doing is not asynchronous. You could actually create a promise that would be resolved immediately, but that's not the typical case for a promise. But in essence, what we have is something that is venable. You're going to have a result of something that is asynchronous. And internally, there's a little bit more that's going on here. Internally within a promise, now these are not things that we really care about or that we access, but internally, if something is going on that's asynchronous, the promise is going to be in three possible states. Either it's pending, or it's fulfilled, or it's rejected. And if it is pending, there's no real values that are associated with it. But if it gets fulfilled, it ends up getting fulfilled with a value. Or if it ends up getting rejected, it ends up getting rejected for a reason. So, when a promise gets fulfilled, we end up fulfilling it with some value, or we end up rejecting it for some reason. But the only thing that we really are concerned about is the fact that we can call then on a promise, and we could handle these two different cases. We could handle a success handler, and we could also handle a failure handler. So one thing that's important to note is that you really can't go backwards with promises. So in this case, we have promise 1, which is pending. There's no data that's associated with it. If it gets fulfilled with a value, it's stated it's going to be fulfilled, and we're going to end up getting a data. On the same token, here we've got another promise that's pending. It has no data. When it ends up getting rejected, it's going to end up getting rejected for a reason. And the key thing there is that the state of the promises are only going to change. They can only change from pending. Once they end up getting fulfilled, that's it. The promise has been fulfilled. Once they end up getting rejected, they end up getting rejected. The thing that's interesting about that is that you could actually access a promise after it ends up getting fulfilled. So there's this whole idea of the timing being ambivalent. So we could have a handler, add a handler, so user promise. When the user promise is fulfilled, we'll end up welcoming the user. And if the promise ends up settling, the handler that we ended up setting with it, welcome user, is going to end up getting called. So the other thing that could happen is if we could actually add the handler after the fact. So if there's a promise that ends up settling, we could end up adding the handler. And again, the handler is going to end up just getting called once. So you don't have to worry about this handler, the welcome user handler, the show hard handler getting called multiple times. Again, as long as the promise is created, right? One of them could be set before it ends up getting fulfilled. One of them could be set after it ends up getting fulfilled, and both of them will end up being satisfied. So, you can end up using these, passing these promises around and not necessarily worry about when the promise ended up getting resolved. So this actually solves a pretty big problem. And, so one of the things that we'll talk about is that when you didn't have this ability, you had this whole idea that you might have to get one promise to have one asynchronous callback, and nested in there would be another asynchronous callback. So one of the quotes that you see here is that you actually have the ability to compose these functions and deal with error handling in a much simpler way. So one of the things that we talk about is callback hell, when we have this sort of deep, nested, repetitive error handling. So, as an example of this, we can have a situation where we're doing something asynchronously, we're fetching a user, we end up getting a response, and we end up deciding we're going to do a console.log when we end up getting the response. So you could take the case of, well, when we end up getting the response, the user data, maybe we want to make another asynchronous call, and we'll have another callback function. And in fact, when we end up getting that other callback function, where we end up getting a message, maybe we'll end up using that, and we'll end up getting these comments. Well, the problem is that during any step of this process, we could have an error that ends up occurring. So you get into these scenarios where you are having to deal with these errors and successes at every step. And the big takeaway is that you have to basically query your arguments, which I mentioned before, to deal with this. So in this case, if we weren't able to get the user data, we would console log something else. Otherwise, we end up digging down deeper, right? If we couldn't get the message, we console log out. Otherwise, we end up going in and digging down deeper. And you could see that this nesting is pretty hard to follow, where promises give us the ability to have something that is very linear. So in this case, get the user, with the user, get the messages, right? From the first message, get the comments. And if in any part of this process there is an error, you could end up dealing with the error by using the catch or by putting any error handler as the second parameter inside of event. So, this I've seen, where people will end up doing is thinking that, they have this callback function and they could end up returning something from the callback function. But that doesn't really do us any good at all, because this variable person is going to be gone by the time this return ends up coming in. So it's not really going to help us out very much at all. And I've also seen, this sort of thing where, okay, we'll end up getting our response back from something that's asynchronous, and we'll put it inside of a variable, and then we'll use it underneath it. But of course, that's not going to work either, because, by the time you end up getting back to that line where headline equals person.name, person might be undefined at that point. So you get into these scenarios where how do you end up handling this thing? And so, in this case, we've got something asynchronous that's happening. And we say, well, when we end up getting this asynchronous thing back, we could end up calling another function with that data. And in fact, when we look at container A, we could keep track of when something ends up getting saved, and we could do something with that data. And that really is, in essence, what promises end up doing for us. So promises have gotten standardized, and there's different specifications for them. And so, some of these promises are already working in browsers. And you could actually, sometimes you'll see where promise will end up being defined even if you didn't end up requiring Bluebird, and that's a result of them already being in ES6s. Now we're going to look at two different approaches for generating the promises, and one other thing to just be aware of is that the jQuery library, and you could read about this, has a deferred object which is a promise, but there is some major issues with it where it doesn't end up following some of the implementations that are pretty critical. So that's just something to be aware of if you're working a lot with jQuery. We really haven't done much with it at this point, so it shouldn't end up being all that much of an issue. So the next thing that we'll talk about is in what libraries do promises end up getting originated from. Libraries that obviously give us some promises right from the get-go. I mean, we've seen how Mongoose ends up returning promises. If we end up writing a Mongoose query, we end up getting a promise back. We'll also be using Angular. So Angular has some promises built in where you can make asynchronous HTTP requests, and that when you end up doing that, you end up getting a promise back that you can end up, that's venable, that you can end up getting your response with. You also have the ability to have something that's asynchronous and use a library to wrap around it, and we'll end up talking about that. And we also have the ability to use our libraries to take a method that's in a native library and make it turn it into a promise. So, Q has the ability to here we're turning the read file into a promise method, and below that we could actually use Bluebird to take all of the asynchronous calls that are in the FS library and turn them into promises. So just to sort of see what that looks like, where the read file ends up, we could pass it 3 parameters. The middle one is optional, but we can read a file, specify the encoding, and here we have this asynchronous callback that we would have to sniff out here. What we could do is that if we use the Q library, we could specify that we are going to denotify it, and we're going to take that function. We're not calling that function, we're wrapping that function, in which case this read file is going to be something that we could then make venable. And again, internally it's just wrapping around this callback function. On the same token, you could actually take a whole object, and you could end up permissifying the entire object, in which case you could do that with the FS module, and in this case, then we could call FS read file async. So you have the ability to do this with existing functions. You could do this manually too. So here's an example of the Bluebird library, which is a constructor-style promise generation. So in this case, you could end up creating a promise. Bluebird has the new promise constructor. You end up passing in a callback function, which will end up getting called with 2 functions. You then end up making, it's up to you who you're writing this code. You end up making your asynchronous call with your callback, and then it's up to you to then end up rejecting or resolve it. In which case now you have this promise, and this promise is going to be venable. And you could use a success handler and a failure handler. And again, here we're putting in some async call, but you could easily end up doing this with the FS read file to permissify it. So there's also another way that you could do this, and this is a deferral-style, and the Q library does this. The Q library is another implementation of promises. This is one that is used in Angular, which we'll end up becoming familiar with. But in this case, a little bit different. Instead of newing anything up, you're creating this deferred object. So the key to this implementation is that you create a deferred object, and you end up using the promise of that deferred object. So this deferred object, $Q, allows you to create something that's deferrable. That deferrable ends up having a promise, and then again, it's up to you to either reject or resolve that promise. So it's just a little bit of a different syntax. It really could end up coming down with anyone that you're comfortable with. So in terms of the way that a deferral works, this is sort of how it looks, where you're going to create your deferred object. And the way that I usually think about this is that if you end up doing this within a function, there are 2 things that are, really 3 things that are critical, but 2 things that you're doing here is that you're creating a deferrable and you're returning the deferrable's promise. And then it's up to you to then decide whether you're going to resolve or reject. And this is something that I'm not too familiar with, but there's also the ability to set up a notify where there could be a way to see how far along your promise is. If you're how far along you are from being resolved. So maybe you want to give some sort of updates on how long something is taking. That's not something I've done, but you can see that that could be somewhat convenient. So the magic of promises really comes about in terms of doing this chaining, in that a then ends up returning another promise. And so if we end up thinking about this promise chain, what we can do is we could end up promising for something, we could end up doing something else, and keep on going down the chain until we have an error. And we could see that this catch is the equivalent of having your first callback function being null and your second function being an error handler. So we have the ability to chain things, and you could see that the then ends up, returning another promise to us. So here's an example that's kind of interesting. If we have this promise, and then we do a then and another then, and we keep on, going down the chain, and assume that promise 0 is going to end up getting resolved with the string hello. What really ends up happening is that when a promise ends up getting resolved or even rejected, it's going to be looking for a place to land. So what happens is that it's just going to end up falling through. It's going to, nothing's going to be handling it in the first then, or the second then, or the third then, and that promise will just, keep on going down, and eventually will end up landing at console.log, in which case the text will end up getting sent to console.log, and it'll end up reading hello. So, on another example here is that if the promise ends up getting fulfilled with hello, right, what if we ended up putting this exception handler in the first, then now we have 3 handlers in the fourth part of the promise chain? We're still going to get the exact same results because we never had an error. This third parameter, set load bar, is actually ignored, doesn't even do anything. So you have this idea of the promise coming through the promise chain. Again, I always like to use the expression that it's looking for a place to land. So we could think of another example here where let's say we have this promise that's going to end up getting rejected. So if it ends up getting rejected, what's going to happen is, again, it's going to look for the first spot here, in which case it's going to end up getting logged out to the error event handler, right? Because there's no other catch here, so this is going to end up hitting the console.log. We can also think here, which is, again, similar to the other one with the success, where, again, we're going to get the exact same thing going on, where we're going to keep on falling through, again, if this is a rejected promise, until we end up getting to this bottom rejection, because that is really the only spot that it could end up landing. So just to sort of look at this, as a, reviewing this here, again, in this first example, if we have a promise that's going to be fulfilled, it's going to be to look for the first spot that it could end up getting fulfilled. If it ends up getting rejected, it's going to look for the first spot that it ends up getting rejected. So you could end up taking a promise. A promise ends up returning another promise, and you can end up assigning that to a variable. But a much more common thing to do is to chain things, which we've seen before. So, in this example, if we end up do a promise for a value 1, and it ends up being successful, and we end up returning value 2, what ends up happening is really the return of that value gets wrapped in another promise that ends up getting resolved. So our first then returns another promise. We end up chaining, and we end up doing that for value 2. So you see that it ends up, going down the chain. And this is, what allows us to make these things pretty linear. So, another example here, where we end up, again, we could assign this promise for user then, right, to another promise, which again, might be the promises for messages, or we could end up, instead of returning a value, we end up returning another promise. So if you just have a value that's in there, it'll a value that's not a promise, what'll happen is that it'll end up returning as a resolved promise, which is thenable. If there is a promise, right, you'll end up getting it just works as a promise, so your success function will end up getting called back when that ends up getting satisfied. So just to kind of round things out a little bit, we spoke a little bit about this before. There's the ability to call multiple promises and have them run serially. So in this case, this would be an example of some code in Angular where we've got a number of API calls. We take this array of strings, we end up mapping them to a promise, and we have a promise on in the Angular library with HTTP get ends up giving us a promise, and we end up getting our response, and we end up getting our data. So we've got these promises, because again, when we end up doing a get and a then, we end up getting another promise, in which case we could end up using q.all for our API promises, and this gives us the ability to loop over each of our API calls. When we think about promises in the mean stack, there's a number of libraries that we could use. We could end up using the Q library. We could end up using the Bluebird library. In Mongoose, we've actually seen some ways of doing this. So there's no findOrCreate in Mongoose, but it's pretty easy to create one, a method, because we could end up saying, if we end up doing findOrCreate, we could end up passing in a model and some properties, in which case, if we end up finding one, we have a promise, which is going to end up getting returned. So if we end up finding one, we end up just returning it, in which case the promise would be satisfied. If we didn't, we end up creating it, which will be another promise that hopefully will be satisfied as well. We could also, promises end up getting used in Angular. This is kind of an interesting implementation. The first one where you could end up using a promise for a date by using a timeout. I've never seen this before, but it was something that I was unaware of, that timeout actually does return a promise that's thenable. Something a little bit more common would be making an HTTP request, which will end up giving you a promise, and then you could then end up using then, or you could end up using catch to get the results of this AJAX call to the server. You could also use the Q library client side, and you could end up doing that and construct your own promises. So we've seen that before where, again, this is something that ships with the Angular library. You could also use the Bluebird library client side as well, but the Q library, as you recall, is the deferred constructor, where you're creating the deferred object and you're returning the promise of that deferred object. Wrap it up for our deeper dive into promises, and we're going to do workshop, which is going to allow us to create our own implementation of a promise library, which I think will even add to your understanding of how promises work.